We were not startled by the sound of the door. Alexander and I stared at each other, holding our breath. What had just happened? Everything had to remain a secret. But now Jackson had come home. Before continuing the story, I ask you for a second to give a like to the video. It doesn't bother you at all, and it helps me a lot. Let's continue. At that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. If you want to keep hearing stories as real and shocking as this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Also, leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts to help us raise awareness about this issue. We were already in the last days of October. It was a warmer than normal Saturday for the season. Outside, fall colors were covering everything. Yellow and reddish leaves danced in the sun's rays. That day I had planned to enjoy my solitude and the quiet of home. My husband Jackson was out of town on a work trip. My stepson Alexander had told me he would be visiting friends. As I dreamed of enjoying my coffee and reading a book in the silence of home, a message came on my phone. "Hello, Lily. Plans with my friends canceled, so I'll be home in a little while." Alexander's message surprised me a little. Relationships in a reconstituted family are always complicated, and ours was somewhat distant. However, deep down I felt it was an opportunity to spend time with him. "No problem," I replied. "You can relax at home as you like." While I waited for him to arrive, I started preparing something in the kitchen. The aroma of roasting chicken already filled the house. I was chopping the vegetables when I heard the door open and Alexander walked in. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, his usual relaxed style. During the meal, we talked about trivial things: school, his friends, the weather. But between our words, there was a kind of tension in the air, as if something unspoken was there, silently watching us. After we ate, we cleared the table together. As I watched him move so confidently around the kitchen, I realized I knew very little about him. We had never spent time together like this before. "Do you have any plans for the rest of the day?" I asked him. "Not just relaxing. Do you?" he replied, pausing for a moment to look at me. "We can watch a movie together," I suggested. It's been a long time since we've spent time alone. My proposal made us smile with a little surprise. "Okay," he said, heading for the couch. With popcorn and stains, we settled into the living room. We put on a comedy movie, but I couldn't help but notice Alexander's presence next to me. Slowly, we began to share our dreams and fears. When he told me he wanted to be a graphic designer, I saw the passion in his eyes. Time flew by. When the film ended, Alexander turned to me and said, "Thank you for being with me today. I really needed it." I smiled. I smiled back. But at that moment, something strange resonated inside me. This bond was something deeper than it should be between a stepmother and her stepson. This was the beginning of a day that would change our lives forever. That day, I felt the bond between Alexander and I grow stronger and stronger. However, these feelings were more intense than I should feel for him as his stepmother. There was an indefinable tension between us, something like a fascinating bond. "Let's play a game," I proposed, trying to lighten the mood. Alexander smiled. "Sure." We played, he asked. We decided on an old board game. The competitiveness of the game helped to lighten the tension a bit. The banter, occasional rubbing, and laughter seemed to make our barrier slowly fade away. Later, as I prepared dinner in the kitchen, he was at my side. Between chopping vegetables and mixing sauces, our movements seemed synchronized. Amid the aromas of garlic and spices, Alexander glanced sideways at me and said, "You're not bad at all at cooking." I smiled back. "Thank you." I've always thought of cooking as a way of expressing love. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "That's nice. Maybe you got that from my mom," he commented. His words left me pausing for a moment. When I looked at him, I no longer saw him as just my husband's son. He was a sensitive and mature young man. This recognition both thrilled and frightened me. Over dinner, our conversation grew deeper. He told me about the challenges in his life and his dreams. What do you think about everything that's going on in your life right now? I asked him, wanting to better understand his world. He sighed, and his serious expression caught my attention. Sometimes it feels hard, he said. School, expectations, people. Sometimes I feel like no one really understands me. I really understand you, I replied, trying to be supportive. But I want you to know that you can always count on me to talk. We stared at each other. There were unsaid things floating in the air. The intensity in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. To break the emotional moment, I suggested watching a movie. I chose something lighter in hopes of relaxing the atmosphere. When we settled on the couch, our bodies were closer than the previous time. The movie was on, but my attention was completely on Alexander. Sitting next to me, every movement, every breath of his left an imprint on me. Every time our arms brushed, I felt a spark, a tingle that I tried to ignore. The silence lasted until Alexander broke it. Can I ask you something? Sure, I answered with my heart beating faster. What's it like to be a stepmom? I really asked. The question caught me off guard. It's complicated, I answered. I always want to be there for you, but I'm aware that I'm not your mother. Sometimes I feel like I'm crossing certain boundaries. Alexander nodded. His eyes reflected sincerity, and that touched me. But you're doing so well. Thank you for everything you do, he said, with a genuine tone in his voice. His words filled me with an indescribable warmth. I smiled. Thank you, Alexander. That means a lot to me. I realized I was getting closer to him. Our eyes met, and the moment seemed to freeze in time. The tension between us was so intense that words could not describe it. Just then the sound of the door opening broke the spell. The magic of the moment suddenly disappeared. Jackson's arrival home changed everything. The sound of the door suddenly dissipated the tension between Alexander and me. I'm home, he shouted from the doorway. Alexander and I quickly exchanged glances. The intensity of a moment ago disappeared, forcing us to face reality. Relax, I whispered, trying to sound natural. He felt that the frustration in his eyes was evident. When Jackson entered the room, we both pretended nothing had happened. We chatted about his trip naturally, but beneath the surface, it was impossible to ignore the tension. Alexander also participated in the conversation, but our words hid what only we knew. That night, while I was alone in the kitchen, Alexander appeared. He leaned against the countertop, watching me silently. Thank you for today, he said. His voice was low but clear. I stopped what I was doing and turned to him. It was a good day, I replied with a slight smile. Alexander moved a little closer with a look that conveyed something deeper. Didn't everything feel different to you? I tried to look away, but his eyes held me. Yes, it was different, I murmured. Before we could say anything else, Jackson called from the living room. Lily, can you help me with this? The moment was instantly broken. When I looked at Alexander again, I felt there was an unspoken agreement between us, something left on pause. As I made my way to the living room, I could feel his gaze following me. That night, as I lay in bed, the moments of the day replayed in my mind, over and over again. I knew I should be more careful, but that thought wasn't enough to dispel what was growing between us. A few days later, while Jackson was at work, Alexander came home early. When I saw him at the door, my heart began to beat faster. You're home early, I asked him, trying to stay calm. I wanted to come here, he replied with a determination I hadn't seen in him before. I was in the kitchen preparing something for lunch. I'll help you with something, he offered. Sure, bring the dishes, I replied with a smile. As we worked together, our shoulders brushed several times. Although I tried to ignore it, every little touch made me feel an inexplicable connection. After lunch, we sat in the living room. Silence filled the space, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like we were both searching for the right words. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. Lily, we need to talk. I hear you, I responded, even though my heart was pounding. I don't think we can ignore this anymore, he said, looking at me seriously. I feel like we're missing something important. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Alexandra matters a lot to me, but there are things we can't overlook. This is not just about us, I told him gently, but firmly. I know, he replied, but I can't deny what I feel. This is real. Her words made me hesitate. It was hard to deny what was happening, but at the same time I knew there were lines we couldn't cross. I understand that, but we have to be responsible. We can't let this get out of hand, I said, trying to find a balance. He felt slowly. Okay, let's not rush anything, but let's also not pretend there's nothing here. His words brought some relief, but also fear. I felt we were entering a complicated terrain, one that could have consequences for both of us. Just then the sound of the door startled us again. I'm home, Jackson announced from the doorway. The conversation was interrupted again, and both of us settled back down as if nothing had happened. But this time I knew it would be harder to ignore what was growing between us. That night, as I went to bed, my thoughts were a whirlwind. The bond between Alexander and I was impossible to deny, but I knew the road we were traveling was complicated and fraught with risk. The days ahead would require strength, honesty, and above all, clear boundaries.